Welcome to the America First War Room. I'm your host, American Greatness Chairman Jim Renacci. Tonight, I want to welcome the host of Always Right Radio on WHK 1420 in Cleveland, Ohio on the Salem Media Network, Bob Frantz. I'm happy to have a good friend, Bob Frantz, on with us today. And Bob, we've talked enough over the years I was in Congress. We had agreements and disagreements, but we're always able to come to the same conclusion in many cases that what's best for America is smaller government, limited government, less taxes, all of those policies that I think are important. So I'm happy to have you on the show tonight.
Well, I appreciate being here. I'm equal parts honored and confused because I don't know what I have to add to any conversation. I'm the question asker, not the answerer. So if you're looking for answers from me, I'll do my very best. But you're right. Obviously, we've been talking for about 8 years now since I started my current show. And I was even a guest at the State of the Union address, and I've always been honored to be able to talk politics with you, talk society with you, talk about how to keep, as your program is called, America First, and that's what I'm excited to do.
I appreciate that. And again, we are the America First War Room. We're going to be talking not only people in the state of Ohio, but people nationally, and a lot of topics, a lot of subjects. And what we appreciate from you, Bob, is that you're talking to people too. So I want to get your perspective. You have the radio show where you're listening and talking to others. So that's what we're looking for. But let's get started. Let's face it, Fauci is back. He is talking COVID. He's actually being deposed in a number of lawsuits. He's talking about the pandemic. And let's face it, President Biden said the pandemic is over, yet Fauci says it isn't. Talking about masks and mandates. We have the Chinese who are actually now protesting, many of the people in China, over the shutdowns, lockdowns. What are your thoughts? What are you hearing? What do you think?
Well, he's back and he's talking, but he isn't. According to the records, not the official transcripts of the deposition for the lawsuit that's been filed against him by the attorneys general in Missouri and Louisiana, he had nothing to say over 7 hours. He couldn't recall his own statements about masking and about, lockdowns, about social distancing and about the severity and all of those other things. He couldn't recall those things, according to what, we're being told by Landry and Schmidt in those two states. So it is kind of interesting how he's trying to cover his tracks. He also, for 2 years plus, has been steadfast in his belief that this was not born of a lab. This wasn't, this virus didn't escape from a lab in Wuhan, that it was probably organic. It was probably something from, the bat to the pangolin to the this, that, the other ended up in a soup in Wuhan, China. And now suddenly he's saying, I'm very open-minded about it. I'm not sure where it came from, but I'm open to the possibility that it could have come from a lab. So I think he's been trying to CYA, the old cover your behind thing, the entire time. And as far as what's going on, for this guy to continue to try to espouse the same types of responses to COVID now, or what might be a COVID season in the same way that we have a flu season, is terrifying. And Jim, it's why I know you joined a lot of people, myself included, in pushing for, medical freedom legislation in Ohio and around the country, so that, what was very, very specific in some of the things that they were agreeable to, and for example, in the Ohio General Assembly is, a specific COVID-related response. But what many legislators and what I pushed for, and I'm still pushing for, is an overall, quote, health emergency legislation that says we cannot shut down businesses arbitrarily based on what somebody like an Amy Acton or a Mike DeWine or anybody else decides is essential versus non-essential. We cannot shut down our schools, and we cannot force people to take jabs or lose jobs. If in any future health emergency, because we all know there's something else coming. If it isn't COVID, it's going to be the next thing down the line. And so when I see what's going on in China, since you brought that up, and the massive protests against the new clampdowns there, I'm worried about what might be in the future here, whether it's a new variant of COVID that they use, that Fauci and others use, or whether it's a new health emergency that they call it, that we're not going to have any more protections against the things that crushed us last time. in the future either. And that's what worries me.
Well, and what's interesting too, Bob, as I talk to some national media outlets when I'm on the radio, national radio shows, they don't realize that we actually suffered through that in Ohio. They keep thinking it was only New York and California. I have to remind them that in Ohio, Governor DeWine actually shut down our state. We still have businesses that have never recovered. He shut down we had our schools go back to where they were, teaching from home, all of those things. So we have firsthand knowledge in Ohio of exactly what happens with shutdowns, lockdowns, masking mandates. We even had, as you remember, the Vax-A-Million, where you would get $1 million if you got vaccinations. All of these crazy things where
scholarships,
everything, and nationally, people aren't aware that we've lived it.
Well, we lived it, and 4,000 Ohio business owners are still living it because their businesses were shut down and never to be reopened. That doesn't mean the government ordered them closed forever, but when you take away their livelihood and their ability to generate revenue for a few months, they cannot recover. It's been 2.5 years now since the beginning of this whole thing in March of 2020. And there are still businesses clinging on, holding on by the skin of their teeth to their businesses. They're still in the red, but they're able to stay operational while they hope their capital starts to be replenished and they start to become more profitable. But Jim, how many Ohio workers lost their jobs when their businesses closed forever, the places for which they worked closed forever? And then how about those people, those business owners, mom and pop shops? Because who survived? The Home Depot survived, Best Buy survived, Giant Eagle, Walmart, the big corporations survived because they've got the ability to do so. But all of the mom and pop shops where people put their whole life savings into it or took out big capital loans or whatever it is to hang out their own shingle, start their own business and do well for 10, 15, 20, 25, 30 years. And suddenly here comes Mike DeWine pulling the plug on their non-essential businesses. And then they just didn't have the wherewithal to stay open. And they're gone forever. So yeah, we suffered in Ohio, in many of the same ways that New York and California and other places did, but sometimes in different ways. And for people to think that we just escaped, unscathed, the way Florida and a lot of other places did that had much better leadership is just not true.
Well, let's hope that Fauci and his gang do not push the Biden administration to these lockdowns and shutdowns, because we already know what will happen based on our experiences in Ohio and nationally as well. But let's turn a little bit now to inflation. This weekend, of course, we had Black Friday. Media outlets are saying that sales are down. Citizens are saying that the prices were too high. People aren't buying. We also have these pent up dollars that many cities and counties and even our state has, where they're going to continue to spend because they have COVID dollars. Inflation's not going away. And then, of course, we have the Fed trying to raise interest rates way too late, trying to bring inflation down. So we still have a mess, but a lot of it deals with this spending spree that Biden has put on us, causing the inflation. What are you hearing about, this weekend spending, inflation? What are some of your listeners saying as well?
Well, you know what? We experienced the same thing everybody else did on Thanksgiving, and that is a much more expensive holiday. And I saw the numbers, and the people who do this thing for a living looked at the average price of turkey, the average price of potatoes, and so on and so forth. And the average American spent between $20 and $25 more to put that meal on the table this past Thursday, than they did the year before. You don't think that's going to extend into holiday shopping, into Christmas shopping, into gifts, as you say, on Black Friday and on Cyber Monday today as well? Of course it is. People just don't have as much. You got to remember two things. Number one, the prices are higher. And number two, the wages are stagnant. That's what the Biden, administration has brought us. And you brought up the Fed trying to, recover this a little bit and try to recover from the inflation by raising the rates. And that's creating a mortgage crisis. You used to be able to get a good solid mortgage, 6, 8, 10, 12, well, maybe a little bit longer ago, kind of right before Biden came in. You get a really good mortgage, a fixed mortgage rate of 3.5%, 4%. And now it's up to 6, 6.5, 7, 8%. That is just, tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars more over the life of a mortgage that people are going to have to pay just to try to correct what Biden did with his radical spending. So if I'm looking for, it's the season of goodwill and the season of positivity, right? Because it's the Christmas season now and the holiday season. It's the fact that we did take the House back. And while they're not going to be able to do a whole lot legislatively, that, how that's why you get out of Washington, as broken as it is, but they're not going to be able to do much with the gridlock. But the even slim majority that they have in the House allows them to put the brakes in some of the radical spending bills. It allows them to have some sort of a check on what Biden's out of control first 2 years have been over the course of his next 2 years. So I'm very encouraged by that, and I'm going to hope that maybe that brings us at least back to a little bit of fiscal sanity, and hopefully those prices start to go down a little bit.
Yeah, while we're on that, we see the Defense of Marriage Act now probably going to get passed in the Senate, definitely going to get passed in the House and signed by President Biden. That's something that would have not happened if the House had even one Republican more. Maybe not. I shouldn't say that, because really for that act to even get passed, they had to convince 9 or 10 or 11 Republican senators to vote for it in the Senate, and it appears they're going to do that. So hopefully this gets us back to some sanity with us taking back the House, even though it's a slim majority.
Well, yeah, and you may know more about it than I do. I know that there were some differences in the two bills, the Respect for Marriage Act on the Senate side and on the House side. And the House side, I think, actually provided some protections for religious freedom and some protections for freedom of speech that the Senate's version did not. So I don't know if they have already, had that consolidation of the bills and worked out and marked it up to add those protections or not. But I do know that earlier today, I was on the radio, and a lot of other people have been as well, urging Rob Portman and urging about, all we need is 2 or 3 senators are needed. And at the time of, that we're on here, I mean, I'm not sure exactly where it stands, but we needed just 1 or 2 of them to not vote for cloture. And that stops this thing from getting rammed through in this lame duck Congress. And that's what really needs to happen. And it's not even about gay marriage or same-sex marriage, as it were. It's about 2 things: religious liberty. And Mike Lee offered an amendment. And I don't know where it sits, but it's about religious liberty and it's about freedom of speech. Because what this does is it completely eliminates the freedom of the individual, either because of faith or just conscience, unless they are actually working for a religious institution. It doesn't follow them into their private lives. So if you work, say, for a church or a synagogue or for anything that may say, we don't believe in this. We believe what the biblical definition of one man, one woman, and you run a business, and that business provides services potentially for weddings, you will not be protected under this law from not wanting to participate in this. You can be sued, and in fact, this Respect for Marriage Act on the Senate side, as I understand it, allows for the Attorney General of the United States or just the Justice Department to actually come after people civilly if they don't participate in these services, ceremonies, etc. So we're literally talking about forced and coerced speech. And of course, if it happens to be, your faith that prohibits you from wanting to do this, now we're talking about religious liberty as well. And that's the danger of this. It's so far beyond same-sex marriage. It's just about our constitutional First Amendment rights.
100% agree. And, it's funny, back in 2015, and I know when I was in the race for governor, this came up many times, but I was actually pushing amendment with 60-some Republicans to make sure religious freedoms were protected. And of course, a lot of people don't realize that even when that amendment failed and that bill failed, so did the protection for religious freedom. So these are the consequences.
That's supposed to be sacrosanct. I mean, is there anything more important than that, honestly, in the entire Bill of Rights than the First Amendment, and in particular, the first tenet mentioned of those 5, and that is the freedom to practice religion as you see fit. You can't be forced to either give up your religious beliefs or violate them because somebody else says so.
Yeah. And quickly, I know this wasn't one of the topics we were going into, but Kevin McCarthy's probably only going to have a 7-8 seat majority. When I was in Congress, Boehner and Paul Ryan had a 30-seat majority, and even that was tough to get things accomplished. What are you hearing? What are your thoughts? A small majority gives you the power to stop things, but it also doesn't give you the power to completely stop things if 7 or 8 or 10 Republicans switch over. And remember, in our House, we're going to have the moderate caucus and we're going to have the Freedom Caucus. So there's going to be infighting on both sides. I think the moderate caucus today, last I saw, is about 50 people. The Freedom Caucus is about 40 people. Kevin McCarthy is going to have his hands full.
Yeah, we're a divided party. I hate to say it, but what the left tried to exploit in the midterms was successful, and they tried to divide the MAGA Republicans from the establishment Republicans, or the Rhino Republicans, as some people call them, or the deep state Republicans. There's a division there. There's no doubt about it. I have a big problem with that, and so will Kevin McCarthy. I am an America First, so I love your name of your podcast. I'm an America First Republican. That doesn't mean MAGA. I am MAGA too, but that means I am devoted to not the leader of the MAGA movement by name. It's not singular devotion to Donald Trump. It's a devotion to what he started, which is making America great again and putting Americans first. I believe in that very, very deeply and very, very sincerely. And the fact that President Trump, who is polarizing to say the least, is the face of that half of it, has created a massive schism in the party. So you're right. Kevin McCarthy is going to have a lot of work to do trying to bring the Freedom Caucus and the more moderate caucus together. And you just said it. If it's a 7 or 8 seat majority, they're not all going to be in lockstep with one another, because the one thing I think that Republicans have that is it's a blessing and a curse is independence of thought. They're not groupthink slaves the way I think the Democrat Party is. And I like that about us. I like that about conservatives, but it can be a curse because you're not going to get everybody going along. You just said it yourself when you talked about the Respect for Marriage Act on the Senate side. They need 11 or 12 Republicans out of, the 50 that there are in the Senate, and they got them. So if you don't think they're going to be able to get, 6 or 7 or 8 Republicans on the House side, depending on the nature of the legislation to flip over, they certainly are going to do that, and it's going to create a very difficult time for Kevin McCarthy, no doubt.
Well, and remember, in the House, they already did pass, as you said, their version, and they did get a number of Republicans to cross over and vote for it too. So it'll be interesting to see where this all ends up. But let's change gears and talk about the Tea Party. In 2009. The Tea Party was formed, and I was actually a business guy at that time, fed up with the government, fed up with what the government was doing, fed up with the spending. And at that time, we had debt of only $10 trillion. And the Tea Party really was rallying around debt. We have to stop the debt. We have to stop the spending. We have to stop all of this government overreach, government spending. And that's where the Tea Party was formed, and that's where it came from. And in 2010, a wave of us, including myself, went to Washington and said, we're going to stop this madness. Problem is, 12 years later, our debt's at $31 trillion. Nobody seems to be paying attention to spending. And quite frankly, I even did a post on my Facebook account that even during Donald Trump's 8 years, spending was growing rapidly. And it's a real issue because spending and debt really causes inflation. It also adds to our children and grandchildren's burden. It's a unfunded future tax, which we used to always talk about, but now we don't seem to see even Republicans talking about it anymore. I want to get your thoughts. How do we come back together? That should be a basic principle that brings us all together. We got to stop the spending. We got to stop this overreach of, remember, when the federal government is spending money, they're overreaching. They're doing everything they shouldn't be doing. It all starts with the money. If you can pull that back, love to hear your thoughts, because we got to come together somehow and get back to that basic principle. We got to stop this debt.
Well, yeah, you're right. I started to say, President Trump's increase of the national debt, or the amount that it increased under his term, was only 4 years. You said 8. He only had 4, and he's up there among the highest in history in terms of the amount of money. Now, I think some of that can be attributed to the last year of his 4 years, because there was all of that massive COVID spending, that was kind of agreed upon by everybody. I think it was a mistake in retrospect, but a lot of that happened because of that. And I'll be honest with you. I find myself, like a lot of people, I think, Jim, overwhelmed by the number. we can't conceive of what $31 trillion is. We couldn't conceive of $10 trillion, which it was just a decade ago, at the rapid rate of increase of that debt, the interest itself. I think people have just kind of written it off. They don't see it for the threat that it is. I think you just put it right. It's a future tax on future generations. But I think a lot of people have just said, we're never paying that off. How can we ever pay that off? I mean, why don't we just thumb our nose at the rest of the world to whom we owe that debt and say, you know what, you owe us a lot more anyway. We saved your butts all of these years. So you know what, we're going to wipe the slate clean. That can't happen. But I think that most constituents, if you look at the midterms, what are the issues that have you most concerned? And you looked and you saw inflation, and you saw the state of the economy right now, and you saw the border, and you saw the crime rates, and you saw abortion. I mean, where did spending come in? And where did the national debt come in? It didn't even register. I think most people can't conceive of it. So they're just like, yeah, I've seen that debt clock. It's kind of funny to watch it spin online when you go to the national debt clock on the webpage. But they just kind of say, we're never going to pay that off. And so it's not a concern to most people. Most of my listeners don't talk about it. I don't talk about it. And you want to know why? Feeling of helplessness. I can't conceive of the number. How do we possibly still pay for all of our needs? How does the government meet all of our needs, all of our budgetary requirements for the military and for infrastructure and everything that we have to have, and begin to pay that down to the point where we're paying more than what the interest is accruing every day or every year, to the point where the principal starts to come off? I think people have just said it's not possible. Close your eyes, don't think about it. Just get on with the daily business. I really feel like people are just kind of overwhelmed by it. That's why they don't even think about it.
Yeah, I hope that's not the case, because look, in 2010, I'll never forget, we had a general speak to Congress saying that our greatest threat to our country is not China, not Iran, not Iraq, it's our national debt. And the minute our national debt gets to a point where we just can't deal with it anymore, we will be just like many of the other countries who actually failed economically, whether it was Greece or other countries who had to rely on every other country to be bailed out. And we're heading to that direction.
Does that point exist, Jim? Help me out there, because I'd like to know what that point is. I would have thought maybe it was $10 trillion. I would have thought maybe it was $20 trillion. Here we are 30, and we haven't reached that point you just mentioned. Once it gets to a point that it's so out of control that we become a failed economic state, what is that point? Is it 50 trillion? I legit don't know.
Well, it's funny. I remember, and I always remember this, in 2012, the Comptroller General, a Democrat, appointed by Barack Obama, came to my office and said, and I was in Congress at the time, said, I'm glad you're talking about this. He said, I believe that our country will be in a Greece-like situation within 20 years. Now, that was 2012, which would mean 2032. We're halfway there. But he said, we will not be able to sustain it. And think about this, Bob. Interest rates are now going up. Every 1 percentage point interest is, I think, $2 trillion to the national debt over 10 years. So, we've just gone up 2 points, 3 points. We are now building the national debt even faster. Our total receipts do not cover our Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and interest anymore. And we had record receipts. So I think we're getting close. The problem is, as you said, nobody's talking about it. They just say it doesn't matter. The 30 trillion, what is scary for me, and I was on the budget committee, it's one of the reasons I left Congress, because I said nobody seems to care anymore. But the 30 trillion, about 5 trillion of it is owed to other countries. 25 trillion is owed to Americans who buy treasury bills. Many of those treasury bills are in people's 401k accounts. They're in people's retirement accounts. When those treasury bills can't be paid anymore, then you got a whole nother problem. It's not just the 5 or 6 trillion that we owe China and owe some of the other countries. It's the 20 to 25 trillion that we owe ourselves. And if you're one of those Americans who have those accounts in your retirement, you're going to lose your retirement account. That's how serious it could be. So I'm hoping we could start talking about it again, put it as a priority. Republicans should be talking about it. We don't talk about it enough. It's one of the things the American Greatness Fund and PAC and our podcasts are going to continue to talk about, because we've lost sight of one of the most dangerous things, even though we have a whole bunch of other problems. And it's that the national debt is going to continue to grow and grow and grow. And at some point in time, we're going to be helpless in trying to pay it back.
So do you see a point right before we get there where either side of the political spectrum, or both parties together, come together and say, we agree, there's the tipping point, that Jim Renacci was talking about, where we're not going to be able to ever overcome this. We're going to start to lose all of our retirement savings, everything you're talking about. Do you think there is ever a point where they say, okay, we agree, here's what we do? Because again, there's that helpless feeling. It's like, how do we begin to address, even on a small scale, something that large in increments? Incrementally, how do we begin to address that? I don't know if that answer exists.
Well, I tell you one thing, and I used to say this when I was in Congress. Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security interests are swallowing up everything. And people will say, don't touch my Medicare, don't touch my Social Security, don't touch those things. So politicians will never talk about it until it's finally at the. By the way, I always chuckled in when I was in Washington. The only time we got anything done was when it was a crisis, whether it was debt ceiling, whether it was funding the government. Always had to be crisis, crisis, crisis. This will be a crisis at some point in time. Politicians will not talk about it because the only way to fix it is to really look pretty close at Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and interest. Now, I also say those are great programs. They should not be cut.
No.
But they should be revised. So why does a billionaire, I'll never forget this, I had a billionaire who has since passed away, said to me, Renacci, I just signed up for Social Security today. This was about 6 or 7 years ago. And I looked at him and said, you don't need it. And he goes, yep, but I paid into it. I'm going to take it. We can revise many of these programs by just being more realistic and realizing that billionaires don't need Social Security. Billionaires don't need Medicare. Now, they did pay into it, but it's an insurance program, supplemental social insurance. That's what Social Security is. It's an insurance program. And like I try and tell people, you pay insurance on your house in case of the need, and you never get that money back. We need to start looking at some of those things. Maybe when you're talking to your listeners, we could start talking about, let's reform some of these things. Let's make sure the programs stay in place. But there are some people that don't need and shouldn't qualify for some of these things. That'd be a great starting point before it becomes a serious problem. And maybe that's a way of bringing together the Tea Party movement again, which was really based on this debt.
Well, you know what? My response would be, I can't condemn or disagree with your idea because I don't have a better one. But you're going to have a problem when you start saying, here's the arbitrary cutoff of what your assets are or your income is, to the point where you don't get to collect on what you paid into. You don't get to collect your Social Security. You don't get to have Medicare coverage. You don't need Medicare coverage. You can provide yourself with all the medical care for 1,000 lifetimes over with the amount of money you have. Who's going to decide what is that arbitrary cutoff point? And then second of all, is that ever justified, considering the fact that we don't even do that with taxes? I mean, this is what the left always says. You make too much money, you've got to pay more of your money in taxes to help everybody else out. And in my view, I think it's got to be something where it's voluntary, I guess maybe is the only word, but we need to appeal to those who are in those, privileged classes, the millionaires and multimillionaires and billionaires, appeal to them to say, here are options. Can you please consider maybe, not taking services and not taking funds, even though you've paid into them, even though they're part of the public, domain, if you will, because you had, they were taken from you, through your earnings. Can you think about what's in the best interest of the country and help us keep these programs solvent for those who do need it? It almost has to be voluntary, because when it's not, I think we start to run into, how much of our liberty are we willing to sacrifice here by saying you paid it, but you can't have it. That's a real hard ask.
Well, remember, and the only thing I would go back to, you buy insurance for a car, you buy insurance for a house, you never collect on it because it's protection for the safety net. And that's really what some of these programs are. So we really do need to think about it. I'll give you one more statistic, then I want to move on. But statistically, you could tax the millionaires and billionaires 100% of their earnings. 100% of their earnings. And we did this when I was on the Ways and Means Committee. We did this calculation.
Yeah,
and
I
you
remember
still
this.
can't fix the deficit and debts.
Nope, not even close. Doesn't even do, yeah. And that's the thing. The left always says, raise, pay your fair share, pay your fair share. That they could pay more than their fair share. Like you said, everything they have, and it still doesn't even come close to fixing the debt or even the deficit. So I completely agree.
So let's talk about, look, we just got through Thanksgiving. It's a great time. I know I had my family with me. People get together with their families. They probably talk politics. I guarantee you, and at least I know that happened in my household, but also across the country. Trump announcing right before that also added one of the talking points for the discussion around the Thanksgiving table in some households, not all, but there is those that realize that President Trump is in this. Now, there are some that want DeSantis to jump in. There's going to be others jumping in as well. There are Republican parties. I just saw an article today in Politico, state Republican parties who were saying, we don't want Trump. Parties, these are total state parties like Pennsylvania, who are upset about what happened in Pennsylvania, where he endorsed two candidates who one lost the Senate, one lost the governorship in a state that probably could have had a Republican senator and could have had a Republican governor. So some states are upset. We've got this issue. I heard you say this earlier. It's one of the things that the American greatness believes. It's the MAGA movement, not the man. But we're continuing to hear these many individuals who say it's Trump, Trump, Trump. You probably hear it on your show. We got to support Trump. We got to do this. Anybody who doesn't support Trump is not a patriot. All of these things. I just want to hear your thoughts. What are you hearing? What are your thoughts? And what do you think?
Well, I'm hearing the same thing, and I'm seeing and hearing a lot of strong conservatives who were MAGA conservatives, who were red hat wearers, Trump sign waivers the whole way through, who are now saying we can't do this again, and here's the reason why. And they're losing followers on their Twitter accounts. I'm losing listeners because there are some people who don't want to hear that. It is all about the man and not just the movement. And I'll be honest with you, I've got a problem with it. I've said this a million times, and I'll say it again. I will never, ever be able to repay Donald Trump for what he did for this country. I mean, we owe him a debt that will be forever. He stopped Hillary Clinton from getting to the White House, being the third term and a worse term than either one of Barack Obama's first two terms, and probably a fourth one. He stopped that. Nobody else in that field in 2016 could have. Just by winning, he did something we can never repay. And then to actually have tremendous success in so many ways, so much terrific legislation that he helped push and get passed through the Congress, orders that were specifically, beneficial to us, getting us out of things like the Paris Climate Accord and other things. So, I mean, he did great things as president. But the reality of the situation is it's a different moment now. And there is so much baggage that he is carrying around. And some will say, well, it's not his fault. It's the deep state's fault. And it's the establishment's fault. And some of that's true. But there are a lot of self-inflicted gunshot wounds as well. There's a lot of things that he has done and says that make it very, very hard for people to push behind him and think that he can win. His unpopularity is so deep. It's not even just the numbers. We always get, approval versus disapproval. But his disapproval isn't just like that's malleable, where he changes a thing or two and he can get above water. Those who disapprove hate him so much, unlike anything I've ever seen in my relatively middle-aged life. So I'm ready to move on with America First that Donald Trump built, with MAGA that Donald Trump invented and created and brought to the forefront, and a pride and a restoration of American greatness that I think a lot of people didn't realize existed, but in a new messenger. And, whether it's Ron DeSantis or whether it's Tim Scott or whether it's, Kristi Noem, there's a whole bunch of people that might be, really strong, viable people. I want to see a robust 2024 field, and Trump is part of it. And make no mistake, Jim, and I'm sure you feel the same way. If Donald Trump emerges from another big PAC as the nominee, I'll get behind him. I will absolutely fight like heck to keep a Democrat out of the White House. Look at what we've already seen for just the 2 years of Biden. I'll do everything I can for Donald Trump if he's our nominee. But at this moment in time, in November of 2022, as I see and as I listen and as I watch things happening and playing out, I'm for the field. Back in the Tigers' heyday, and the Masters, they would say you have Tiger or the field. Tiger or anybody else is going to win it. I'm in the field right now. I want somebody else to win this other than President Trump at this moment in time. Now, if he emerges, like I said, I will be wearing the hat and pushing and campaigning and doing everything I can for him. But for now, I'm in the field and I want to see somebody else be the messenger.
It's funny you say that because I 100% agree that, look, we owe him so much for jumping in this race. It's one of the reasons why I endorsed him in 2016 when nobody else was endorsing him, because I wanted change. I wanted something different. He brought that, and he stopped Hillary Clinton. Probably was the only person that could stop Hillary Clinton at the time, because he pulled Democrats over to his side, especially many who believed they had been forgotten. So from that standpoint, I truly do thank him and appreciate what he's done. But I got to tell you, even on my social media, if I say anything negative about Trump, I just get a swarm.
Oh, yeah.
And it's amazing because, you know, he does have his faults. And I posted that post on Facebook where in 4 years, he increased the debt by $8.2 trillion. A lot of MAGA Republicans don't understand that, but he was actually part of that because he didn't do anything to stop it. And you're right, he did add some COVID stuff, but those are the kind of things that we just have to reflect on. But we also have to reflect on, and you said it best, the self-imposed wounds. He has self-imposed wounds. But here's one of the concerns. If the field is big and there's 7 or 8 people running for president, he will win the primary because he does hold that 32 to 35%. He doesn't hold 51% anymore of the party. There was a time he probably controlled 80%, but he's at about 32%. The more people in the race, the more opportunity for him to win. If he does win, I will 100% support him. But I will also tell you this, and I'll bet you'll agree with this. He's the greatest magnet for Democratic voters to come out. And that is going to be probably our biggest problem in the general election in 2024.
Yeah, I concur, Jim. And, I think the other, you said he's got his faults and his supporters, again, of which I am one in the right circumstances, his supporters don't want to hear about those. And here's the real difficult thing. I understand why they feel that way, because he was treated so unfairly by the press, like no one has ever been treated before, because of the collusion investigation, the nonsense with Mueller, the 2 impeachments, the J6 committee, 9 prosecutors, 0 defense attorneys, all up there to smear him on J6. I mean, all of those things, he's been treated so unfairly by those others who will point out his faults. That's why so many of his most ardent supporters look at us and say, we don't need to hear it from you too. Can we lay off his faults because we already get him from the other side enough? I get that. Yeah. I do. And I also feel one other way, and I don't know how much time you have left, but I'll say one other thing. I feel bad for the guy because I truly believe he was robbed of his second term. I will never not believe that after all the evidence that I've seen presented. It was stolen from him. And there's a element, I think, of a lot of us who just feel justice needing to be served, want him to get his second term back just to say, you stole it, you tried to keep me out, and you couldn't, I'm back anyway. There's a lot of people, I promise, feel like they just want justice to be done. He got the votes, he should have been the second term president, and they took it from him, so let's right that wrong. And I think that's going to be a real big factor in this whole thing too.
100% agree. I hope we get a field that is MAGA Republicans. I hope we get a field that is America First Republicans. There will be some that aren't. But I hope we get enough that there is a choice. And if Donald Trump is a choice, I will be 100% behind him as well. So these are the things that are going to be coming up over the next couple of months and weeks. And many of the things we'll be talking about on American Greatness. Well, again, I want to thank you, Bob, for being on the show. I appreciate it. This was a good discussion. It's going to be the discussions we're going to be talking about at the American Greatness Fund and AmericanGreatnessPAC.com. Please, listeners, if you're interested in what you saw today and what some of the things we'll be talking about in the future, please go to the AmericanGreatnessPAC.com or the AmericanGreatnessFund.com. Look up what our podcasts are, where we're going to be going, what we're going to be talking about, and many of the issues as we try and move forward with the MAGA movement and the America First movement over the next 2 years as we move toward 2024. Thanks for watching the America First War Room. I'm your host, American Greatness Chairman Jim Renacci.